You have given advice to a friend that you have never once followed yourself. Specific advice. Good advice. Advice that worked for them. You knew exactly what they needed to do. You said it clearly. They did it. Their life improved. You went home and continued not doing it. This is not hypocrisy. This is the gap. The specific, maddening distance between what you understand and what you actually do. Between the person you can clearly see yourself becoming and the person who keeps showing up instead. You've lived in this gap so long it feels like personality. It isn't. It's architecture. And architecture can be changed. Here's what's actually happening. Your mind is running two separate operations that rarely communicate. The conscious system, the one reading this, the one that understands things, the one that makes plans and sets goals and knows better. And the automated system underneath it, which was built earlier, runs faster and doesn't particularly care what the conscious system has decided. The automated system was installed young, before you had the cognitive equipment to evaluate what was going in. A parent's repeated frustration became a belief about what you're worth. A teacher's offhand comment became a ceiling on what you attempt. A peer's cruelty became a prediction about how people see you. None of it was filed under possibly wrong and worth revisiting. It was filed under true. I understood this intellectually for years before I understood it in any way that changed anything. There's a specific humiliation in recognizing a pattern in yourself, naming it accurately, and then watching yourself run it again anyway. Like being a very informed passenger in a car you're not driving. The conscious mind is the passenger. This book is about learning to drive, not by suppressing what's underneath, not by positive thinking your way past a system that predates your ability to think positively, by actually understanding the mechanics, what's running, why it's running, and the specific conditions under which you can interrupt it long enough to choose something else. That choice. Small, unglamorous, available in ordinary moments. That's what this is about. The 7-year-old wrote the first draft. It's time to edit. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The operating system nobody asked for. Your beliefs about money, love, and what you deserve were mostly finalized before you lost your first tooth. Sit with that for a moment. The convictions quietly shaping your career, your relationships, your sense of what's possible for a person like you. Most of them were formed by someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. Not metaphorically, literally. The architecture of your adult life was drafted by a child with incomplete information and no ability to fact-check. This is not a tragedy. It's just the way development works. But it becomes a tragedy the moment you stop noticing it. Here's what actually happened. Your brain, in its early years, was running in something close to a hypnotic state. Theta waves, high absorption, low filtering. You weren't evaluating what adults said to you. You were downloading it. Every repeated message, every emotional charge, every offhand comment delivered with enough force or frequency went straight in. No review process, no quality control, just storage. And those stored files became your operating system. The problem isn't that this happened. The problem is that the system keeps running long after the original conditions have changed. You are no longer 6. The teacher who said you weren't smart is not in the room. The household that treated money like a source of shame is not your household. But the software doesn't know that. Software doesn't check the calendar. Picture a man in his late 30s, talented, genuinely. gets close to a big opportunity every time, then finds a way to not quite reach it. A miscommunication here, a sudden loss of confidence there. He calls it bad luck. His friends call it self-sabotage. Neither of them is looking far enough back. Somewhere around age 9, he learned that wanting too much made people uncomfortable. He learned it from someone he loved. He never unlearned it. That's not a story about ambition. That's a story about an operating system running a 30-year-old subroutine. The technical term for all of this is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically rewire itself based on repeated experience. Neuroscientists will tell you this is good news, and it is. It means the system isn't permanent. New inputs create new pathways. Old pathways, unused, weaken over time. The brain you have today is not the brain you have to keep. But here's what the good news version of this story leaves out. The old pathways don't disappear just because you've decided they should. They thin. They quiet. They lose their automatic grip. That takes repetition, consistency, and the kind of patient attention most people only apply to things they enjoy. Deciding to change your beliefs is roughly as effective as deciding to change your accent. Intention is the beginning, not the mechanism. I spent about 3 years telling myself I was someone who handled uncertainty well. I said it. I believed I meant it. Then a particular situation arrived, not even a serious one, and I watched myself respond with the exact pattern I thought I'd replaced. The belief had changed. The wiring hadn't caught up yet. So what does catching up actually look like? It starts with something less exciting than transformation. It starts with inventory. You have to know what's running before you can decide what to keep. And most people have never done this. Not because they're incurious, but because the programs are designed to feel like reality. You don't question reality. You just live in it. The way to find the programs is to follow the results, not the intentions. The results. Where do you consistently underperform relative to your actual capability? Where does the same problem keep arriving in different costumes? Where do you hit a certain ceiling and mysteriously stop climbing? That's not fate. That's a file running in the background, redirecting your behavior just enough to keep the outcome familiar. Familiar is not the same as good. The mind doesn't optimize for happiness. It optimizes for consistency with its own model. It will work against your goals to preserve its predictions. It will manufacture evidence for beliefs that damage you, because the alternative, being wrong about something it decided decades ago, is neurologically more threatening than staying stuck. This is the part people find hard to accept, that the mind, your mind, would rather be right than happy, but it would. And until you take that seriously, every technique in this book will be applied on top of a foundation that keeps shifting. The goal of this chapter isn't to depress you, it's to show you where to look. Because once you see the operating system, once you can feel it running in real time, rather than just suffering its effects, you have something you didn't have before. You have a choice about whether to believe it. The 7-year-old drafted the blueprint. That doesn't mean you have to live in the building. Chapter 2. The Witness. Most people have never once watched themselves think. They've just been thinking, like a dog chasing its own tail, but with more existential consequences. This is not an insult. It's a description of the default human condition. Thought arrives, and you become it. Fear arrives, and you are afraid. Doubt arrives, and you are doubtful. The weather passes through, and you forget you're not the weather. You forget there's a sky. There is a sky. This is the chapter about finding it. Conscious awareness, real awareness, not the motivational poster version, is the ability to observe what's happening in your mind without immediately being consumed by it. It sounds simple. It is genuinely difficult. Not because the practice is complicated, but because your mind has spent years perfecting the art of pulling you in before you notice you've moved. Here's what it looks like in practice. Something happens. A critical email, a dismissive tone, a plan that falls apart. Before you've finished reading the second sentence, there's already a story running. You're already the wronged party, or the failure, or the person who should have known better. By the time you respond to the email, to the person, to the situation, you're not responding to what happened. You're responding to the story your mind wrote in under 4 seconds. And the story, more often than not, is a rerun. The practice of conscious awareness begins not with stopping thoughts, that's like trying to stop weather, but with noticing them. Creating the small gap between stimulus and story where something like choice can exist. The gap doesn't feel like much at first, a half second, a brief hesitation before the automatic response kicks in. But that half second is the whole game. Everything else in this book lives inside that gap. Psychologists have a name for the part of you that can observe your own thinking. They call it the observing self. It's not a mystical concept. It's a functional one. There is a version of you that can watch the angry thought without becoming the angry thought. That can notice the fearful story without accepting it as a weather forecast. That can sit with an uncomfortable emotion without immediately needing to make it stop. Most people never meet this part of themselves. Not because it's hidden, but because the noise is so constant, there's no quiet in which to find it. I watched a colleague once, genuinely sharp, someone I respected, walk into a presentation he'd prepared well for and dismantle himself in real time. Not because the room was hostile, the room was fine. But somewhere in the first 2 minutes, a thought arrived. Probably something about being judged. Probably something old. And he went with it. Completely. By slide 3, he was a different person than the one who'd walked in. The thought had found no resistance. There was no observer home. The practice itself is almost embarrassingly straightforward. You sit. You notice what arrives. You don't try to change it. You don't grade it. You just watch. A thought about what you need to do later. A low hum of anxiety with no clear source. A sudden memory that has no business being here. You see it. You note it. You let it pass. What you're doing, neurologically, is strengthening the prefrontal cortex's relationship with the amygdala. You're building the circuitry that creates delay between impulse and action. You're training the part of the brain that governs conscious choice to assert itself before the automatic systems take over. It is, in the most literal sense, a workout. And like a workout, the results don't show up during the session. They show up 3 weeks later when someone says something that would have derailed you entirely, and instead you feel it arrive. You notice the pull, and you pause. Not because you're suppressing anything, because there's now enough space between the stimulus and the response that you can actually choose what happens next. This is what people mean when they talk about emotional intelligence, though they rarely describe it this clearly. It's not that emotionally intelligent people feel less. It's that they've built a larger buffer between feeling and reacting. The emotion is still there. The observer is just faster. There's a distinction worth making here between observation and detachment. Some people, when they first encounter this practice, use it to go numb, to intellectualize their way out of feeling anything. That's not awareness. That's avoidance with better vocabulary. The goal isn't to stop caring. The goal is to stop being hijacked. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to want things badly and feel disappointed when they don't arrive. Awareness doesn't require you to be serene. It requires you to know what's happening while it's happening. That's a different thing entirely. The awareness practice also extends to patterns. The behavioral sequences you run so automatically, you've stopped noticing them as choices. You get criticized, and within seconds you're either attacking or withdrawing. You face uncertainty, and within minutes you're either over-planning or avoiding. You get close to something important, and something reliable arrives to complicate it. These aren't random. They're grooves, worn deep by repetition. You can't change a groove you can't see. Awareness is what makes the groove visible, not as a condemnation, as information. There it is again. That thing. I can see it running. And in the seeing, just the seeing, nothing else required, the grip loosens slightly. That loosening is everything, because mastery doesn't begin with transformation. It begins with the moment you realize something is happening and you are not entirely at its mercy. The moment you become the witness and not just the defendant. The sky was there the whole time. You just kept mistaking yourself for the clouds. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, The Architecture of Impossibility. The most effective prison ever designed has no walls, no guards, and a door that's been unlocked the entire time. You've probably lived in one. Most people have. Some people never leave. A limiting belief doesn't feel like a belief. That's the engineering marvel of the thing. It feels like an assessment. Accurate, reasonable, based on available evidence. It feels like the kind of clear-eyed realism that separates serious adults from naive optimists. It feels, in other words, exactly like truth, which is precisely why it's so difficult to argue with. You can't fight a wall you can't see. You can only keep walking into it and concluding that walls are inevitable. Here's how the architecture gets built. Something happens, usually early, usually during a moment of emotional intensity when the brain is most impressionable. A parent, exhausted, says something they don't mean. A teacher, distracted, grades more than the paper. A peer, threatened, says the thing that lands exactly wrong. In that moment, a conclusion forms. Not a conscious one. A felt one. Something about what you are, what you're worth, what people like you can expect from the world. The conclusion gets filed. The brain, doing its job, begins collecting evidence to support it. Not because it's malicious, because that's how belief maintenance works. Confirmation bias isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system. The mind looks for what it already knows. It finds what it looks for. The file gets thicker. The belief feels more true. The wall gets higher. And none of this is happening where you can see it. What you see is the result. The opportunity you talked yourself out of. The relationship you kept slightly at arm's length. The version of success you allowed yourself, and the larger version you dismissed before anyone else could dismiss you first. You see the pattern and call it personality. You call it reality. You call it just how things are for someone like me. That phrase, someone like me. If you've ever thought it in a limiting context, and you have, there's a file worth finding. The beliefs that do the most damage are rarely the dramatic ones. Nobody walks around consciously thinking I am fundamentally unworthy of love. It's quieter than that. It's the slight hesitation before saying what you actually think in a meeting. The way you deflect a compliment so reflexively you don't notice you've done it. The ceiling you place on your own goals before you've written them down, just to be safe, just to be realistic, just to avoid the specific pain of wanting something fully and not getting it. That last one is its own kind of architecture. The preemptive shrink. You make the goal smaller before the world can make it smaller for you. It feels like wisdom. It's actually a negotiation with a limitation you've never examined. I had a version of this around visibility. For years I framed it as introversion, as preference, as not needing external validation. All of which was partially true. But underneath the reasonable explanation was something less flattering. A belief, installed early, that being too visible invited a specific kind of attack. The reasonable explanation was real. It was also a very comfortable place to hide. Now, how do you find these things? You follow the resistance. Not the dramatic resistance, the quiet kind. The slight internal flinch when a certain topic comes up. The subject you change just a little too smoothly. The goal you've been meaning to pursue for 3 years and somehow never start. Resistance at that level isn't laziness, it's protection. The mind protecting a belief it's decided is structural. You also follow your results, specifically the consistent ones. Not the bad days. Everyone has bad days. The patterns, the recurring themes, the specific flavor of stuck that keeps returning regardless of the external variables. External circumstances change. The same outcome keeps arriving. That's not circumstance. That's architecture. Once you find a limiting belief, really find it. Not just intellectually identify it, but feel where it lives. The instinct is to attack it, to argue it out of existence with logic and counter-evidence. This works occasionally. More often it doesn't, because the belief wasn't installed logically and can't be fully uninstalled that way. It was installed emotionally, in a moment of intensity, and it needs something with equivalent emotional weight to shift it. This is why reading about limiting beliefs rarely changes them. Understanding is the beginning. It is not the mechanism. What actually moves them is a combination of things. Repetition of new evidence. Not just knowing the counterexamples exist, but genuinely letting them land. Visualizing the alternative so vividly and so consistently that the nervous system starts to update its predictions. And action, specifically, the kind of action that the belief says is impossible, taken small enough to be survivable but real enough to generate actual data. The data matters. The brain believes experience more than argument. Every time you do the thing the belief said you couldn't do, imperfectly, anxiously, with the old voice running commentary the entire time, you generate a new data point. One the system has to account for. Do it enough times and the file starts to look less convincing. The wall doesn't disappear. It just stops feeling load-bearing. There's something worth saying about the people who never examine any of this. They're not suffering from a lack of intelligence or effort. They're suffering from a lack of a specific kind of courage. The willingness to look at something that feels like truth and ask whether it actually is. That question is more threatening than it sounds. Because if the belief is wrong, then the decisions made in its service need re-examining. The avoided risks, the surrendered ambitions, the years spent inside a prison with an unlocked door. That's not a comfortable inventory, but it's a necessary one. The belief isn't you. It's a conclusion a younger version of you drew from incomplete evidence under emotional duress. You are allowed to reopen the case. You are allowed to look at the evidence again with the full cognitive capacity of the adult you've become. You might find the wall was always thinner than it looked. You might find it was always a door. Chapter 4. The Night Shift. There's a part of your mind working right now that has never once taken your side in an argument. Because it doesn't argue. It just acts. While you're busy having opinions, making plans, and maintaining the useful fiction that you're in charge, the subconscious mind is quietly running approximately 95% of everything you actually do. Your habits, your emotional reactions, your automatic assumptions about what's safe, what's possible, what you deserve. All of it processed below the level where your conscious intentions can reach. This is not a self-help metaphor. This is neuroscience. The conscious mind is the part of the operation you can see. The subconscious is the operation. And here's the uncomfortable implication. If you've been trying to change your life exclusively through conscious effort, through deciding, intending, and willing yourself into new behavior, you've been negotiating with the receptionist while the CEO runs the company unchanged. Politely, persistently, and largely without effect. The subconscious mind doesn't respond to argument. It responds to repetition, emotion, imagery. And, this part matters, timing. Your brain moves through different electrical states throughout the day. Beta waves when you're alert and analytical. Alpha when you're relaxed, lightly focused, beginning to drift. Theta when you're in that strange, suspended state between sleeping and waking. Half here, half somewhere else entirely. Delta when you're fully asleep. The threshold states, alpha and theta, are when the subconscious becomes most accessible. The critical filter that normally evaluates incoming information loosens. The deeper layers of the mind become, for a brief window, genuinely receptive to new programming in a way they simply aren't during normal waking hours. This is not mysticism. It's the neurological basis for why hypnotherapy works, why you often solve problems in the shower, why the idea that arrives just before sleep sometimes feels more true than anything you thought all day. The analytical guard is off duty. The deeper system is listening. Most people spend these windows unconsciously. They wake up and immediately reach for their phone, flooding the most receptive minutes of their neurological day with other people's emergencies, opinions, and highlights. They fall asleep replaying arguments, scrolling feeds, or watching something designed by professionals to be impossible to stop watching. The subconscious gets programmed anyway, just not intentionally, just not by them. The morning window is roughly the first 15 minutes after waking, before full analytical consciousness has assembled itself. The evening window is the last 15 minutes before sleep, when the mind is already beginning its descent. What you feed these windows matters disproportionately, not because of magic, because of access. What goes in during these states bypasses the usual skepticism and lands closer to the level where behavior actually originates. I know someone new, really, we've lost touch, who was one of the most genuinely talented people I've encountered in a particular field. Could have been exceptional. Had every external condition in place. But every night without fail, he'd spend the last hour before sleep relitigating the day's failures. Every slight, every misstep, every distance between where he was and where he thought he should be. He called it processing. He was actually programming, nightly, consistently, with extraordinary emotional intensity. He couldn't understand why nothing seemed to change despite his effort. The effort was real. The direction was just backwards. So what goes into these windows instead? Visualization, but not the passive kind, not the vague imagining of good outcomes. Specific, sensory, emotionally engaged mental rehearsal. You in the scenario, not watching yourself, being yourself. The physical sensations, the specific details of the environment, the emotions that would actually be present if this were real. The subconscious doesn't reliably distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. This is not a bug. It's the mechanism you're using. Affirmations work here too, but only under specific conditions. The statement has to be believable enough not to trigger immediate internal rejection. If you're carrying significant self-doubt and you spend the morning insisting you are supremely confident, the deeper system will produce something between indifference and active resistance. The gap between the statement and the felt reality is too wide to bridge in one assertion. Bridge statements work better. I am developing confidence in situations that used to unsettle me. I am becoming someone who handles this differently. These are true in a way the subconscious can accept, because they describe direction rather than claiming arrival. They don't trip the skepticism wire. They slide past it. Repetition is non-negotiable. This is where most people abandon the process. Not because it isn't working, but because it isn't working fast enough to feel like it's working. The current patterns in your subconscious were installed through thousands of repetitions over years. You are not going to overwrite them in a week of good intentions. What you will do, with consistent daily repetition, is begin to create competing pathways. New routes that the brain can take instead of the old ones. Initially, the old routes are faster. They're more established, more automatic, more deeply grooved. But used pathways strengthen. Unused ones thin. Over weeks and months, the new route starts to feel more natural. The old one starts to feel like a choice rather than a default. This is neuroplasticity operating on a schedule. Boring, reliable, and real. The subconscious also responds to environment. What it's surrounded by. What it repeatedly encounters. What the physical world keeps reflecting back. This is why the room you work in, the images you see daily, the conversations you regularly have all function as low-level programming. Not dramatically, cumulatively. The mind is always learning from context. Give it a context that contradicts what you're trying to build, and you're adding friction to an already difficult process. Give it a context that supports what you're building, and the process gets quieter. Less like pushing, more like leaning. The subconscious mind is not your enemy. It's an extremely powerful system that was programmed without your informed consent and has been running faithfully ever since. It doesn't know the programming is outdated. It doesn't know the world has changed. It knows what it was told, and it acts accordingly with total commitment and zero judgment. Your job isn't to fight it. It's to update it. Carefully. Repeatedly. At the right times. The night shift has been running your life. It's time to give it better instructions. Chapter 5. The voice in the room. If a stranger said to you what you say to yourself before a big moment, you'd never speak to them again. You'd find it remarkable, actually. The specific cruelty of it. The timing, always right before something matters. The precision with which it finds the exact doubt most likely to land. You'd remove that person from your life with a clarity and speed you rarely apply to anything else. But it's not a stranger. It's you. So you call it honesty. You call it keeping yourself grounded. You call it the necessary counterweight to arrogance. And then you wonder why the big moment never quite feels like you showed up fully for it. The internal monologue is the most underestimated force in a person's psychology. Not because it's loud, it's often not. It's constant. That's the thing. Not a dramatic speech before the battle. A continuous low-frequency signal running underneath everything, shaping what you notice, what you attempt, what you decide you deserve before anyone else gets a vote. 60,000 thoughts a day. Research suggests around 80% of them negative, 95% repetitive. The same material, recycled, running the same conclusions, arriving at the same destinations. Not because you're broken, because that's what unmanaged thought does. It loops. It reinforces. It mistakes familiarity for accuracy. Most people, when they first encounter these numbers, feel briefly horrified and then do nothing about it. Because the thoughts feel like weather, impersonal, inevitable, something that happens to you rather than something you're generating. And the moment you accept that frame, you've handed over the controls without realizing there were controls. There are controls. The internal voice isn't you. It's a pattern. A deeply grooved, highly practiced pattern that learned its material from the same sources that installed your limiting beliefs. Early experiences, repeated messages, emotionally charged moments that got encoded as permanent truth. The voice sounds like you. It uses your vocabulary. It knows your specific insecurities with unsettling accuracy. But it is not the final word on anything. It's a pattern. And patterns can be interrupted. The first step is simply catching it. Not judging it, not fighting it, not immediately trying to replace it, just noticing it happening in real time. Most self-talk runs entirely below conscious attention. You feel vaguely deflated after a conversation and don't track back to the 17 small negative statements that ran while it was happening. You lose confidence in a project gradually and attribute it to the project rather than to the commentary you've been providing throughout. Catching the voice means developing a layer of attention specifically dedicated to monitoring the internal broadcast. Not obsessively, just enough that the automatic becomes visible. What you're listening for isn't dramatic. It's the quiet stuff. The casual self-dismissals that don't feel like a big deal because you've been saying them for 20 years. I'm not really a person who I've never been good at. That's just how I am. These phrases feel like self-awareness. They're actually self-programming. Every repetition deepens the groove. Language matters here more than most people realize. Not in the superficial sense of replacing negative words with positive ones. That's the bumper sticker version of this work. In the structural sense. The words you use internally determine the kind of thinking you can do. Words like always and never foreclose possibility. Words like sometimes and in this situation keep it open. Words like should and must generate resistance and quiet resentment toward your own goals. Words like choose and want generate agency. These aren't aesthetic preferences, they're neurological architecture. The difference between I have to give this presentation and I'm choosing to give this presentation is not a trick. It's a genuinely different relationship to the same event. One puts you at the mercy of something external. One puts you back in the driver's seat. The nervous system responds to these framings differently. Your performance responds accordingly. There's a particular move worth learning: the catch and redirect. You notice the negative pattern mid-run. You don't argue with it, don't try to prove it wrong, don't engage with its content. You simply redirect. Not to the opposite. The opposite often feels false enough to generate resistance. to something truer, something your system can actually accept. Not "I always mess up" replaced with "I never mess up." That's just lying in a different direction. "I always mess up" replaced with "I'm someone who's learning what works through direct experience." That's not positivity. That's accuracy. And accuracy the subconscious can absorb. I once spent an embarrassingly long time in a loop I can only describe as competitive self-criticism. Not with other people, with myself. Like I was trying to identify every flaw before anyone else could, as if that would somehow neutralize the damage. I was thorough about it. I was consistent. I was, in retrospect, doing the opposition's work for them at no charge. The reframe that eventually shifted, it wasn't positive thinking. It was a simple question. Would I accept this analysis from someone I didn't trust? The voice had all the confidence of expertise and none of the credentials. I'd been listening to it like testimony under oath. The inner critic, left unexamined, functions like a prosecutor who's also the judge. It presents evidence. It decides what it means. It delivers a verdict. And you accept it because the voice is inside your head, and that feels like authority. It isn't authority, it's habit. What replaces the inner critic isn't an inner cheerleader. That's just noise in the other direction. What replaces it is something closer to an inner coach. The distinction matters. A critic evaluates performance and finds it wanting. A coach evaluates performance and asks what it teaches. A critic protects its own conclusions. A coach is interested in what's actually true. The coach asks different questions. What can I learn from this? What would I do differently? What does this situation actually require from me right now? These questions don't feel as emotionally satisfying as a good self-flagellation session. There's no drama in them, no punishment, no sense of having taken responsibility through suffering. But they're vastly more useful. They point forward. The critic only ever points at you. There's also the matter of how you speak about yourself to other people. The casual self-deprecation that's become social reflex. I'm terrible with names. I'm the worst at this. I can't help it. I'm just. Every time you say it, even as a joke, even as social lubrication, it goes in. The subconscious doesn't know you were being charming. It files it under confirmed. The voice in the room shapes everything. Your confidence before you walk in. Your interpretation of how it went after you leave. The ceiling you place on the next attempt. It's running during your most important moments and your most ordinary ones. It's the background radiation of your entire psychological experience. You don't silence it. You don't transcend it. You learn to hear it accurately, not as truth, not as authority, but as a pattern with a history and a logic that made sense once and may not anymore. Then you decide, deliberately and repeatedly, what you'd rather say instead. The voice is in the room either way. The question is whether you hired it or inherited it. Chapter 6. Weather patterns. You are not angry. Anger is passing through you. The distinction sounds philosophical until you're about to send an email you can't unsend. Most people treat emotions like identity. Fear arrives and they become a frightened person. Shame arrives and they become a shameful one. The emotion moves in, puts its name on the door, and starts making decisions. Major ones, irreversible ones. And then it leaves, because emotions always leave. And the person is standing in the wreckage of choices made by a houseguest who's already gone. This is not a character flaw. It's a design feature running past its useful range. Emotions evolved as information systems. Fast, physical, impossible to ignore. They were never meant to be ignored. They were meant to be read. Fear tells you something in the environment requires attention. Anger tells you a boundary has been crossed or a value violated. Sadness tells you something mattered enough to lose. These are not malfunctions. These are messages. The problem is that most people never learned to read them. They learned to react to them. And reacting to an emotion is like reacting to a fire alarm by running in the direction of the loudest noise without checking whether there's actually a fire. Sometimes there's a fire. Sometimes someone burned toast. The distinction between these two situations is only available to someone who has developed enough space between feeling the alarm and acting on it to actually look around first. Here's how emotions actually work, mechanically. Something happens in your environment. Your brain, drawing on every prior experience and belief it has stored, interprets the event. That interpretation, not the event itself, generates the emotional response. Two people receive the same piece of critical feedback. One experiences it as useful information. One experiences it as confirmation of their worst fears about themselves. The feedback didn't produce two different emotions. The interpretations did. This is either the most empowering thing you'll hear today or the most annoying, depending on where you currently are with your circumstances. Because it means that emotions, while real and valid and not to be dismissed, are not the objective measure of reality they feel like. They are your mind's best current guess about what's happening and what it means, filtered through every belief, wound, and assumption you've accumulated. Your mind is a good guesser. It's not always right. The practice of emotional awareness begins with a linguistic shift that feels trivial and isn't. Moving from "I am angry" to "I notice anger" is present. From "I'm devastated" to "I'm experiencing something that feels like devastation right now." The distance created by that language is not denial. It's the gap in which choice becomes possible. You are not your emotions. You are the awareness in which emotions arise. This distinction, genuinely absorbed, changes your relationship to your entire inner life. There's a further layer that most conversations about emotional intelligence skip entirely: the difference between primary and secondary emotions. A primary emotion is your immediate, authentic response to a situation. Secondary emotions are the emotions you have about those emotions. And the secondary ones are frequently where the real suffering lives. You feel afraid. Primary emotion. Valid, present, informative. Then you feel ashamed of feeling afraid. Secondary emotion. Layered on top, adding weight without adding information. Then you feel frustrated at yourself for feeling ashamed of feeling afraid. Tertiary, if we're being thorough. Now you're 3 levels deep in emotional weather that started as a single cloud. And the original signal, "There is something here worth paying attention to," is completely buried under the accumulated commentary. Most people's emotional lives are less about what they feel and more about how they feel about what they feel. That's where the volume gets turned up to a level that makes clear thinking impossible. The antidote to secondary emotion isn't suppression. It isn't forced positivity. It's something simpler and harder. Acceptance of the primary emotion without the judgment that generates the secondary one. You are allowed to be afraid without that fear meaning something has gone wrong with you. You are allowed to feel disappointed without that disappointment becoming evidence for a larger story about your inadequacy. The emotion is the emotion. It doesn't need a verdict. I'm genuinely not good at this, with a specific flavor of frustration. The kind that comes from watching something avoidable happen slowly. I can see the secondary emotion forming. I can observe myself adding a layer of impatience on top of the original frustration, making it larger and louder than the situation requires. I know what's happening. Knowing doesn't always stop it. Sometimes the gap I described earlier is about a half-second wide, and I don't always catch it in time. I'm telling you this because the goal isn't perfection. It's frequency. Catching it more often. Missing it less. The body is crucial to all of this in a way that purely cognitive approaches to emotion tend to underestimate. Emotions are not just mental events. They are physical ones. They live in your chest, your throat, your stomach, your jaw. The tightness that arrives before a difficult conversation. The specific weight in your shoulders during prolonged stress. The way anxiety has a particular texture in the body that is distinct from excitement even when the heart rate is identical. Learning to read emotions in the body before they've fully assembled themselves into thoughts and stories gives you earlier access to the information and more time to choose your response. The breath is the fastest route to this. Not as a performance of calm, but as a genuine physiological intervention. Slow, deliberate breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It physically shifts the body's state. It is not a metaphor. It is biology. When the body calms, the emotional weather doesn't disappear, but it becomes readable instead of consuming. Reframing is perhaps the most powerful cognitive tool for emotional mastery. Not reframing as denial, but as a genuine search for a more complete interpretation. The critical feedback that devastated you. Is it possible it contains something useful? The plan that fell apart. Is there information here that the original plan was missing? The person who disappointed you. Is there a version of this story in which their behavior makes sense from inside their experience, even if it's not acceptable from inside yours? Reframing doesn't excuse, it expands. It takes a situation that the mind has locked into a single meaning and asks whether that's the only meaning available. Usually, it isn't. Emotional mastery, fully understood, is not about feeling less. It's about feeling more accurately, more completely. With less distortion from old beliefs and unexamined assumptions. It's about receiving the information emotions carry without being governed by the noise they generate. The weather will come. It always comes. The question is whether you're someone who watches it from inside a solid structure or someone who builds their house in the storm every time and acts surprised when it doesn't hold. Chapter 7. The Attention Economy of One. Your phone is engineered by some of the smartest people alive specifically to prevent you from doing what you're trying to do right now. This is not paranoia. It's a business model. Entire teams of engineers, psychologists, and behavioral scientists have spent careers studying exactly how to make you pick up the device, stay on the device, and feel a low-grade discomfort in its absence that sends you back to it again. They are very good at their jobs, and they are competing directly with your ability to think deeply, work meaningfully, and build anything that requires sustained attention. You are not losing this battle because you lack discipline. You're losing it because you're bringing discipline to an arms race, and the other side has better weapons. Understanding this doesn't solve the problem, but it reframes it usefully. The person who can't stop checking their phone isn't weak-willed. They're human, responding predictably to systems designed by experts to produce exactly that response. The solution isn't shame. It's architecture. Different architecture, built by you for you, around a clear understanding of what attention actually is and why it matters more than almost anything else you own. Attention is not just a productivity tool. It is the mechanism through which you experience your life. Whatever you consistently attend to grows in your perception, in your reality, in its influence over your psychology. Problems attended to persistently become larger. Opportunities attended to specifically become visible where they were previously invisible. Gratitude attended to regularly rewires the brain's default evaluation of circumstances in ways that functional MRI studies find genuinely striking. You are not just choosing what to think about. You are choosing what becomes real to you. The brain's attention system was not designed for this environment. It evolved for a world where novelty meant potential threat or opportunity, where the snap toward anything new and moving was survival behavior. That system is still running. Every notification, every scroll-triggered surprise, every algorithmically placed interruption is directly exploiting a mechanism that kept your ancestors alive on the savannah. Your ancestors would have been terrible at deep work too. They would have been very good at not getting eaten. You, presumably, are not in immediate danger of being eaten. But your brain doesn't fully know that. The result is an attention system that is simultaneously your most valuable cognitive resource and your most easily hijacked one. Training it requires understanding the difference between two things people routinely conflate: concentration and attention. Concentration is forced. It's the gritted teeth application of willpower to a task your brain doesn't particularly want to do. It's effortful, finite, and exhausting in the specific way that fighting your own neurology is exhausting. Concentration is what you're using when you're reading a document you don't care about and have to reread every paragraph because your mind keeps escaping. Attention is different. Attention is what happens when genuine interest, clear purpose, and appropriate challenge align around a single point. It doesn't feel like work in the same way. It feels like engagement. Hours can pass. The phone loses its pull, not because you're resisting it, but because you've forgotten it exists. The gap between these two states is not a personality trait. It's a design condition. Most people are trying to concentrate when they should be designing for attention. They're using willpower to force engagement with tasks they've never made genuinely compelling, and then concluding that they have a focus problem when what they actually have is a meaning problem. Clarity of purpose is the most underrated focus tool available. When you know precisely why something matters, not in the abstract, not as a vague aspiration, but in specific, felt, personal terms, your brain allocates attention to it differently. The reticular activating system, the brain's relevance filter, promotes things that connect to your goals and values above the ambient noise. You see the relevant opportunity in the cluttered room. You hear your name across a loud party. You cannot miss what your brain has decided matters. Give your brain a clear target, and it will orient toward it automatically. Give it a vague one, and it will find its own targets, usually the ones engineered by someone else to be maximally compelling. Environmental design is not a supplement to focus. For most people, it's the primary intervention. The research on ego depletion, the finding that willpower is a finite resource that depletes with use, suggests that every act of self-control draws from the same limited reserve. Every time you resist checking your phone while trying to work, you spend a small amount of that reserve. Do it enough times, and the reserve runs low. Then you check the phone. The solution is to not require the act of resistance in the first place. Phone in another room. Website blockers during focused work. A physical space your brain has learned to associate with deep concentration. These aren't crutches. They're intelligent allocation of a limited resource. You're not avoiding discipline. You're spending it on things that matter instead of burning it on things that shouldn't require it. Single tasking is worth discussing directly because the cultural mythology around multitasking is remarkably persistent, despite decades of research pointing in one clear direction. Multitasking, for cognitive work, is not a skill some people have and others lack. It doesn't exist. What exists is task switching. The rapid movement between items that fragments attention, increases error rates, and costs what researchers estimate is 20 to 40% of productive capacity. Every switch has a cost. The cost is small per instance and enormous in aggregate. One thing at a time, done with full attention, produces better work in less time than several things done simultaneously with divided attention. This sounds obvious. Almost nobody does it. Meditation deserves a practical rather than mystical framing here. Because the mystical framing puts a lot of people off something that is genuinely useful. What meditation actually trains, specifically the kind where you focus on your breath, notice when your mind wanders, and return without judgment, is exactly the cognitive skill required for sustained attention. The noticing and returning is the workout. The wandering is not failure. The wandering is the weight. Every return is a repetition. Do enough repetitions, and the attention muscle gets stronger. Not as a metaphor, as a measurable neurological change. The prefrontal cortex thickens slightly with consistent practice. The default mode network, the brain's wandering, ruminating, self-referential system, becomes easier to quiet. The ability to sustain focus on chosen targets improves in ways that transfer directly to work, conversation, and every other domain where presence matters. 10 minutes a day is enough to begin. Not enough to transform everything. Enough to start building something. The concept of deep work, extended periods of distraction-free concentration on cognitively demanding tasks, is worth taking seriously, not just as a productivity strategy, but as a quality of life one. People who regularly do deep work report higher satisfaction, stronger sense of meaning, and greater confidence in their capabilities. Not because deep work is inherently noble, because the experience of operating at your actual cognitive ceiling, of producing something that required the best of what you have, is one of the more satisfying experiences available to a human being. And it is becoming rare, which means it is becoming valuable, in every sense of the word. Flow states, the subject of a later chapter, are the far end of the attention spectrum. The state where concentration stops feeling like effort and becomes absorption, where performance peaks and time distorts. These states don't arrive on demand, but they arrive more reliably when you've been training attention consistently, when the environment supports deep engagement, and when the task is calibrated to the edge of your current capability. You can't will yourself into flow. You can design conditions that make it likely. Recovery matters here too, in a way that pure productivity framing misses. Attention is not just depleted by distractions, it's depleted by sustained use. The brain needs genuine rest to restore its capacity for focus, and genuine rest is not scrolling. Genuine rest is walking without a destination, looking at something large and quiet, allowing the mind to wander without giving it a feed to wander into. The default mode network, when left genuinely alone, does useful things. It consolidates learning. It makes unexpected connections. It processes emotional material that analytical thinking can't reach. The insight in the shower is real. The solution that arrives on the walk is real. These are not lucky accidents. They're the product of a brain that was given space to do what it does when no one's demanding anything of it. Give it that space. Protect it with the same seriousness you protect your focused work time. Because here's the thing about attention that rarely gets said plainly. You become what you repeatedly attend to. Not metaphorically, structurally. The neural pathways that handle what you focus on most get stronger, faster, more automatic. The ones handling what you ignore thin and quiet. Your attention is not just how you spend your time, it's how you build your mind. Spend it like it matters, because the people on the other side of your phone screen already know it does. Chapter 8. Load-bearing cracks. Resilience isn't a personality trait. It's scar tissue with better PR. The people you think of as naturally resilient. The ones who seem to absorb difficulty without buckling. Who come back from setbacks with unsettling speed. Who appear constitutionally immune to the kind of despair that flattens others. They are not built differently. They were broken differently. And more importantly, they broke in situations where breaking taught them something about their own capacity to reassemble. Resilience is not the absence of damage. It's the accumulated evidence that damage hasn't been fatal yet. This matters because the self-help version of resilience, the motivational poster version, the bounce-back stronger version, presents it as something you cultivate in calm conditions, so you'll be ready when difficulty arrives. That's not how it works. You do not build resilience before the hard thing. You build it during. The hard thing is the gym. There is no other gym. This is uncomfortable news for anyone hoping to prepare their way past pain. You can prepare for difficulty. You cannot prepare instead of experiencing it. The preparation changes how you move through the hard thing. It does not replace the hard thing. And the hard thing, navigated, survived, integrated, is what actually builds the capacity you were hoping preparation would provide. So what separates the people who come out of difficulty stronger from the people who come out of it diminished? Not the difficulty itself, the story. Psychologists studying resilience have identified something they call explanatory style, the habitual way a person narrates events to themselves, particularly negative ones. It operates along 3 dimensions. Permanence. Is this situation temporary or forever? Pervasiveness. Is this problem specific or does it contaminate everything? Personalization. Is this entirely my fault or does it involve factors outside my control? People with low resilience tend to explain setbacks as permanent, global, and entirely personal. This always happens to me. Everything falls apart when I'm involved. I ruin things. These explanations feel like honesty. They feel like taking responsibility. They are actually the architecture of learned helplessness, the neurological state in which effort feels pointless because the link between action and outcome has been narratively severed. People with high resilience explain the same setbacks differently. This particular approach didn't work in this situation. This area is difficult for me right now. There were factors here I didn't control and factors I could have handled better. These explanations are not more optimistic. They're more accurate. They preserve agency. They leave room for different action producing different results. The story you tell about what happened determines what you believe is possible next time. And what you believe is possible next time determines whether you try. There's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. The finding that some people, after significant adversity, don't just return to their previous baseline, but actually develop capabilities, perspectives, and depths of character they didn't possess before. This is not universal. Trauma can also diminish. The difference, research suggests, lies substantially in whether the person is able to find meaning in the experience. Not to justify it, not to be grateful for it, but to extract something from it that serves their continuing life. Meaning-making is not the same as silver lining thinking. Silver lining thinking minimizes the difficulty. Meaning-making takes the difficulty seriously and asks what it taught, what it revealed, what it demanded that in being demanded expanded something. These are different cognitive moves with different psychological outcomes. I sat with someone once, not a formal situation, just a conversation that turned serious, who had lost something genuinely significant. Not a setback, a real loss. And what struck me wasn't how they described the loss itself, but how quickly they moved to what it had revealed about their priorities. Not performing acceptance, actually using the experience as information. I didn't say anything useful. I mostly just watched someone do the hardest version of meaning-making in real time and understood for the first time that it was a skill, not a temperament. The growth mindset, Carol Dweck's framework, which has been cited so many times it risks losing its force, is essentially an explanatory style applied specifically to capability. A fixed mindset treats ability as static, setbacks as evidence of permanent limitation, and effort in the face of difficulty as either pointless or embarrassing. A growth mindset treats ability as developing, setbacks as information, and effort as the mechanism through which capability increases. The practical difference between these two mindsets is enormous and shows up in a specific behavior. What you do in the moment after failure. Fixed mindset after failure. Withdrawal, defense, avoidance of the domain where the failure occurred. Growth mindset after failure. Analysis, adjustment, return. Not because the growth mindset person feels better about failing. They don't. Because their story about what failure means doesn't include a verdict about who they permanently are. Cognitive flexibility is the structural version of this. The ability to update your thinking when circumstances change. To generate alternative approaches when the first one fails. To hold your current plan loosely enough that new information can actually change it. Rigid thinking isn't stubbornness exactly. It's the mind protecting its predictions, which, as we discussed in Chapter 1, it prioritizes over almost everything else, including your actual well-being. Flexible thinking requires a particular tolerance for being wrong, not performing humility about being wrong, actually being comfortable with discovering that your current model of a situation is incomplete and needs updating. This is harder than it sounds because being wrong, at a neurological level, activates some of the same threat responses as physical danger. The brain does not distinguish clearly between a threat to your body and a threat to your beliefs. Resilient people are not more comfortable with being wrong because they care less. They're more comfortable with it because they've decoupled their identity from their conclusions. I was wrong about that is not the same as I am wrong. The first is data. The second is an identity statement. Keeping those two things separate is a daily practice with significant returns. The role of the body in resilience is consistently underestimated in psychological literature that focuses primarily on cognition. Your capacity to handle stress is directly related to your physical state, not as motivation or as discipline, as biology. Sleep deprivation reduces prefrontal cortex function in ways that impair exactly the emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility that resilience requires. Chronic physical stress depletes the same neurological resources needed for psychological recovery. You cannot think your way to resilience while systematically undermining the physical substrate that thinking runs on. The brain is not separate from the body. It is part of it. Taking care of the body is not a lifestyle preference. In the context of resilience, it's a structural requirement. Social support matters here too, but in a specific way. The research doesn't support the idea that more relationships equals more resilience. It supports the idea that quality of relationships matters enormously. Specifically, whether your relationships include people who tell you the truth, who maintain their belief in your capability when yours has temporarily collapsed, and who can offer perspective that isn't available from inside your own current narrative. The value of someone who knew you before the difficulty is particular. They carry a version of you that predates the current story. They remember what you were like before this became the thing you're defined by. That memory, offered at the right moment, can do something that no self-directed resilience practice can fully replicate. Purpose. The sense of being connected to something that extends beyond immediate comfort or convenience is perhaps the most reliable predictor of resilience across all the research. Not because purpose makes difficulty less difficult, because it provides a reason to move through difficulty rather than stop at it. The person who knows why they're doing something can endure almost any how. The person who has lost their why finds even small obstacles disproportionately defeating. This is not an abstract observation. It's a practical one. When you're in the middle of something hard, the question, "What is this for?" has different answers available, depending on whether you've done the work of knowing your purpose clearly. Vague purpose provides vague fuel. Specific purpose. This matters because of this specific thing I care about for these specific reasons. Provides something you can actually use when the difficulty is immediate and the motivation is nowhere in sight. Resilience built consciously looks like this: a growth mindset applied to explanatory style, cognitive flexibility applied to your own conclusions, physical maintenance applied as seriously as psychological practice, relationships cultivated for depth over breadth, and purpose examined specifically enough to be useful under pressure. It also looks like cracks, visible ones, the kind that show where the structure has been tested and held. The Japanese art of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold. The breaks become the most beautiful part of the object. The history of damage becomes the history of survival, and the survival becomes the art. Your cracks are load-bearing. They're holding the weight of everything you've already come through. That's not a small thing. Chapter 9. The rehearsal. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between a memory and a vivid imagination. This is either wonderful news or a complete disaster, depending on what you've been picturing. Most people, upon learning this, immediately inventory the last week of their mental imagery and feel briefly alarmed. The catastrophic scenarios they ran before difficult conversations, the failure loops they rehearsed before important presentations, the elaborate mental reconstructions of things that went wrong, played back in high definition, with full emotional accompaniment, sometimes for hours. All of that was training, just not intentional training, just not for outcomes they wanted. The brain doesn't add a disclaimer to imagined experience. It doesn't tag vivid mental imagery as fictional and therefore neurologically inert. It processes it. It responds to it. It builds pathways from it exactly as it builds pathways from real experience, with the crucial variable being vividness and emotional engagement, not whether the event actually occurred. This is the neuroscience behind visualization, stripped of the mysticism that tends to attach itself to the concept and make serious people dismiss it. It's not about manifesting, it's about programming. You are a system that learns from experience. Vivid imagination is experience your nervous system can learn from. The question is whether you're directing that process or leaving it to whatever your anxiety decides to rehearse tonight. The research on mental rehearsal in athletic performance is extensive enough to be genuinely difficult to dismiss. Studies comparing groups who practiced physically, groups who practiced mentally, and groups who combined both consistently show the combined group outperforming both others. The mental practice group, in several studies, outperforms the physical-only group on specific measures. Olympic programs across multiple sports have included formal visualization training for decades, not as a motivational supplement, but as technical preparation. The mechanism is straightforward. Vivid mental rehearsal activates the motor cortex, the cerebellum, the premotor areas, the same neural systems engaged during actual performance. The pathways built during mental rehearsal are not identical to those built through physical practice, but they're close enough to matter. Close enough that the nervous system, encountering the real situation, finds something already partially familiar, already partially grooved. The performance doesn't start when you walk in the room. It started the last time you closed your eyes and ran it. What separates effective visualization from wishful thinking is a set of specific conditions that most people either don't know about or don't bother with. The first is perspective. Research suggests that first-person visualization, seeing the scene through your own eyes as if it's happening to you, produces stronger neural activation than third-person visualization, where you watch yourself from outside. You want to be in the scene, not observing it. The sensory details should be yours. What you see from where you're standing, what you hear in that specific room, what the physical sensations of the activity feel like in your hands or your body. The second is emotion. This is where most visualization practice fails. People construct the visual scene with reasonable care and then run it with the emotional engagement of someone filling out a form. The emotional component isn't decoration, it's the mechanism. Emotion is what makes experience memorable, what makes it neurologically significant, what determines whether the brain treats an event as worth encoding or worth ignoring. When you visualize yourself succeeding at something, you need to feel what success in that moment would actually feel like. Not a general positive feeling, the specific emotion, the specific physical sensation, the particular quality of confidence or relief or satisfaction that would be present in that exact moment. That specificity is what creates the neural imprint that transfers to real performance. The third condition is specificity of content. Vague visualization produces vague results, not because the universe is unresponsive to vague intentions, but because the brain builds pathways from specific information and has little to work with when the input is general. "I am giving a great presentation" is not a visualization, it's a caption. A visualization is the specific room, the specific people, the specific opening sentence, the physical sensation of your feet on the floor and your hands relaxed at your sides, the quality of your voice as you begin, the particular way this audience responds in the first 30 seconds, the moment a question arrives, and the specific way you feel as you consider it and respond. That level of detail is what the nervous system can actually use. The fourth condition is state. Visualization done in a relaxed, focused state produces stronger neural effects than visualization done in the middle of your commute, while also thinking about what to have for lunch. The alpha and theta brain, states discussed in Chapter 4, the transitional periods between waking and sleeping, are particularly effective for visualization practice because the critical filter is quieter and the subconscious more receptive. A few minutes of deliberate relaxation before visualization significantly increases its impact. Mental rehearsal applies far beyond performance preparation. It can be used for emotional regulation, visualizing yourself moving through a difficult conversation with the calm and clarity you want to bring before you're actually in it. For fear reduction, gradually exposing your nervous system to scenarios that currently produce anxiety in imagination, where the emotional charge can be processed without the real-world consequences of avoidance. For identity building, consistently visualizing yourself as the person you're becoming, thinking and behaving and responding from the values and capabilities you're developing. That last application is underused and important. Most people visualize outcomes. They picture the goal achieved, the result obtained, the finish line crossed. This has value. But visualizing the process, who you are on the way, how you think, how you handle setbacks, what you do on the difficult Tuesday when nothing is working, builds something more durable than outcome visualization alone. It builds the identity that makes the outcome possible. There's a technique sometimes called future pacing that's worth adding to the toolkit. You project yourself forward 6 months, a year, 5 years, to a point where you've achieved a specific goal. And from that vantage point, you look back at the path that led there. What decisions did you make? What did you stop doing? What did you start? What did the difficult middle period require? This isn't fantasy planning. It's a way of using the brain's narrative construction abilities to identify the actual steps by imagining having already taken them. The brain is good at reverse engineering. Give it the destination and ask it to reconstruct the route, and it will find things your forward-facing planning missed. I used to dismiss visualization as something other people did. Athletes, maybe. People with a particular relationship to performance anxiety I didn't share, or thought I didn't share. Then I was preparing for something that mattered in a way I hadn't anticipated, and found myself running the worst-case version of it involuntarily for 3 days straight. The negative rehearsal was already happening. I just wasn't directing it. The choice wasn't between visualizing and not visualizing. It was between directing the rehearsal or leaving it to my nervous system's default preference for catastrophe. I directed it. It helped in ways that were specific and measurable. There are obstacles to effective visualization worth naming directly. The first is the inability to hold clear mental images. Some people genuinely find visual imagination difficult, and forcing it creates frustration rather than practice. For these people, the visualization can be more kinesthetic, focused on physical sensations and emotions rather than visual detail, with equivalent effect. The modality is less important than the vividness and emotional engagement. The second obstacle is perfectionism about the visualization itself. People stop the mental rehearsal every time it goes wrong in imagination, every time the imagined performance falters, and restart, trying to get a perfect run. This is counterproductive for 2 reasons. First, a rehearsal that includes handling things going slightly wrong and recovering is more useful preparation than a rehearsal where everything is perfect. Second, the perfectionist restart pattern reinforces the same perfectionist pattern you're likely trying to move away from in real performance. Let the visualization be imperfect. Let it include recovery. The nervous system learns from the recovery too. The third obstacle is consistency. Single sessions of visualization produce minimal lasting effect. Daily practice, even brief, produces cumulative neurological change. The pathway building happens through repetition. 10 minutes of deliberate mental rehearsal each morning, sustained over weeks, builds something qualitatively different from occasional longer sessions that feel more dramatic but compound less. Your nervous system is rehearsing constantly. Every anxious projection, every replayed failure, every imagined judgment from someone whose opinion you've decided matters. These are all rehearsals. The brain is building from all of them. The question isn't whether to rehearse. The question is whether the production you're preparing for is the one you actually want to perform. Chapter 10. The Discipline Myth. Discipline is not a character trait. It's a series of very boring decisions made by someone who set things up correctly the night before. The mythology around discipline is remarkably durable. The idea that certain people possess an internal force, call it willpower, call it self-control, call it grit, that allows them to consistently do what needs doing, regardless of how they feel. That this force is either present in sufficient quantities, or it isn't. That its absence explains failure, and its presence explains success. This mythology is comforting in a specific way. If discipline is a trait you either have or lack, then the person who consistently fails to follow through isn't making poor decisions about their environment and systems. They're just built wrong. Nothing to be done. Very sad. Pass the marshmallows. The research doesn't support this story. What the research supports is considerably less dramatic and considerably more useful. Willpower is real. It is also finite, depletable, and subject to conditions that have nothing to do with character. The phenomenon researchers call ego depletion, the finding that self-control draws from a limited cognitive resource that weakens with use, means that the person who successfully resisted 3 temptations before noon has measurably less capacity to resist a 4th than someone who hasn't been tested yet. This is not weakness. This is neuroscience. The muscle metaphor is accurate. It fatigues under load. The implication is direct and underappreciated. Structuring your life to minimize the number of self-control battles you have to fight is not laziness or avoidance. It is intelligent resource allocation. Every decision point you eliminate, every temptation you remove from your environment rather than relying on willpower to resist, every friction you add between yourself and the behavior you're trying to stop. These are not cheats. They are the actual strategy. The person with the junk food out of the house isn't more disciplined than the person with the junk food on the counter. They're making the same choice less often, and making a choice less often means spending less of a finite resource. And spending less of that resource means having more of it for things that actually require it. Environmental design is the most underused tool in behavior change. Not because people don't know about it, the concept isn't complicated, but because it feels unsatisfying. It doesn't feel like conquering yourself. It feels like admitting you can't trust yourself. These are not the same thing. One is accurate self-knowledge applied strategically. The other is a story about character that has nothing to do with how behavior actually works. The most important distinction in the discipline conversation is the one between motivation and discipline. A distinction that sounds obvious and is routinely ignored. Motivation is an emotional state. It arrives unpredictably, feels compelling while present, and disappears without notice or apology. Motivation is why you join the gym in January with genuine enthusiasm and stop going in February with genuine confusion about what changed. Nothing changed except the emotion. The emotion was never a reliable foundation for consistent behavior. It was a starting condition, not a sustaining one. Discipline is what operates in the absence of motivation. It's not the suppression of the unmotivated feeling. You can feel completely unmotivated and still act. It's the decoupling of action from emotional state. The behavior happens not because you feel like doing it, but because you've decided it happens, and you've built the conditions that make not doing it harder than doing it. This sounds grim. It isn't. Because the decoupling of action from feeling is what makes progress consistent rather than intermittent. And consistent progress, compounded over time, produces results that intermittent bursts of motivated action never approach. The compound effect of small, consistent actions is genuinely difficult for the human mind to intuit, because we are not naturally good at understanding exponential accumulation. We understand dramatic change, the big decision, the transformative moment, the before and after. We consistently underestimate the power of showing up every day and doing something unremarkable. 20 minutes of reading every day is over 100 books in a decade. Not metaphorically, literally. The math is not impressive on a Tuesday. It is impressive at the end of the decade when you meet the person who didn't do it. Habit formation is where discipline and neuroscience intersect most practically. A habit, properly formed, is a behavior that has been transferred from the conscious decision-making systems, which require effort and deplete with use, to the automatic systems, which run without conscious oversight and cost essentially nothing. The goal of discipline, strategically understood, is not to maintain constant conscious control over your behavior. It's to automate as much beneficial behavior as possible, so that conscious control can be reserved for genuinely novel situations. The habit loop, cue, routine, reward, has been described extensively enough elsewhere that detailed repetition isn't warranted here. What's worth emphasizing is that the cue and the reward are where most habit-building attempts fail, not the routine itself. People focus on the behavior they want to install and neglect the trigger that will reliably initiate it, and the reward that will make the brain want to repeat it. An implementation intention, the specific plan of when, where, and how a behavior will occur, roughly doubles the probability of follow-through compared to a vague intention to do the thing. Not because the specificity is magic, because it eliminates the decision in the moment. The decision has already been made. The brain encounters the cue and the routine runs. No negotiation required. Keystone habits deserve particular attention because they're disproportionately valuable. These are behaviors that, when established, tend to pull other positive behaviors in their wake, not through willpower cascades, but through identity shifts and environmental changes that accompany the anchor behavior. Regular exercise tends to improve sleep, which improves cognitive function, which improves decision-making, which improves almost everything else. The mechanism isn't magical. It's a combination of physiological effects, identity reinforcement, and the structured time that exercise requires carving out from less useful activities. Find the keystone. Build there first. Let the other behaviors follow. Identity is the deepest lever in the discipline system and the least discussed in practical terms. The research of James Clear and others on identity-based habit formation points to something important. Behavior that aligns with your self-concept requires less willpower to maintain than behavior that contradicts it. When you see yourself as a person who exercises, the question on a difficult morning isn't whether to go. It's just what kind of person shows up today. When you see yourself as someone trying to exercise, every session is a fresh negotiation. The shift from trying to being is not semantic. It's a reorganization of the motivational system. Trying locates the behavior outside your identity, something you're working toward. Being locates it inside, something you already are. The latter is self-reinforcing. The former is exhausting. The practical move is to adopt the identity before the evidence fully supports it. Not as self-deception, as intention made specific. I am a person who reads every day. I am someone who handles money carefully. I am someone who does the hard thing first. Say it enough. Act from it consistently enough. And the brain begins to build the self-concept to match. The behavior reinforces the identity. The identity reinforces the behavior. The loop once running, generates its own momentum. I had a period where I was genuinely confused about why a particular practice kept failing to stick. I'd start, maintain it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then drop it in a way that felt almost involuntary. I eventually realized I'd never actually decided I was someone who did that thing. I was someone who was trying to do that thing, which meant I was always one hard week away from stopping. The identity shift didn't make it effortless. It made stopping feel like a choice rather than a default. That's the difference. Not ease. Consciousness. Delayed gratification. The willingness to accept a smaller reward, now in exchange for a larger one later, is perhaps the most consequential discipline skill available. The famous Stanford marshmallow studies and the decades of follow-up research consistently find that the ability to delay gratification correlates with better outcomes across health, finances, relationships, and professional achievement. Not because waiting is inherently virtuous, because almost every meaningful goal requires accepting present discomfort for future benefit. And the person who can do this consistently has access to a category of results unavailable to the person who can't. The ability to delay gratification is also trainable. It improves with practice of exactly the kind this chapter describes. Small, consistent acts of choosing the longer-term option over the immediately available one. Each instance builds the neural pathway. Each pathway makes the next instance slightly easier. Recovery is the final piece of the discipline system that most accounts leave out. The muscle metaphor for willpower is apt in a direction most people don't take it. Muscles require rest to grow. Willpower depleted without recovery doesn't just return to baseline. It can drop below it, producing the phenomenon of decision fatigue that leads to poor choices in areas entirely unrelated to the original depletion. The judge who makes harsher rulings before lunch. The executive who approves worse decisions at 5 p.m. than at 9 a.m. Building in genuine recovery, not productive recovery, not optimization of the rest period, just actual rest, is not a concession to weakness. It's maintenance of a system. The system works better maintained than run to exhaustion. Discipline, fully understood, is not the heroic suppression of your baser impulses through sheer force of character. It's a set of systems, environments, identities, and habits designed by someone who knows their own patterns honestly enough to stop relying on feeling motivated and start relying on something more durable. The boring decisions made the night before are the heroic ones. They just don't make good movies. Chapter 11. Lenses. 2 people walk into the same room. One sees an obstacle. One sees an opportunity. The room has not changed. This isn't about optimism. It's about something more fundamental and less discussed. The fact that what you perceive as reality is not reality. It's the output of a set of filters, frameworks, and interpretive lenses that were mostly installed without your knowledge and have been shaping what you notice, what you miss, and what you decide is possible ever since. Mental models are these lenses. Everyone has them. The difference between people who navigate life with increasing capability and people who keep arriving at the same destinations isn't intelligence or effort or circumstance. It's frequently the quality of the frameworks through which they're interpreting their experience. Bad lenses don't just distort what you see. They determine what you look for. And what you look for is largely what you find. The mind is not a passive receiver of reality. It is an active constructor of it. Your brain processes roughly 11 million bits of information per second through your senses. It brings approximately 40 of those bits to conscious awareness. The selection process, What gets elevated from the noise into your conscious experience is run by your mental models. They are the editorial system deciding what counts as relevant, what gets flagged as important, what gets filtered as background. Change the editorial system, and you change what appears on the front page of your experience. Literally, not metaphorically. This is why two people with identical circumstances can have such radically different experiences of those circumstances, and why advice that worked for someone else sometimes fails entirely when applied to your situation. They're not running the same operating system. The same inputs produce different outputs depending on the lens through which they're processed. The most consequential mental model most people carry, and the one least likely to be examined because it feels most like just how things are, is the question of agency. The degree to which you believe your actions influence your outcomes. Psychologists call this locus of control, internal locus. What happens to me is substantially influenced by what I do. External locus. What happens to me is substantially determined by factors outside my control. Neither extreme is accurate. The world is neither fully controllable nor fully random. But where you sit on this spectrum has enormous practical consequences, because it determines whether you look for leverage or look for explanations when things go wrong. The person with a strong internal locus looks at a setback and asks what they can do differently. The person with a strong external locus looks at the same setback and looks for what or who caused it. Both might be partially right. Only one of them is looking where the available power actually is. The growth versus fixed mindset distinction. Dweck's framework, which arrived in Chapter 8 and is worth revisiting from a different angle here, is really a mental model about the nature of capability. Fixed. Ability is a fixed quantity you either have or don't, revealed by performance. Growth. Ability is a developing quality, shaped by effort and learning, revealed imperfectly and temporarily by current performance. These aren't just attitudes. They're lenses that produce different behaviors in response to the same inputs. A challenge encountered through a fixed mindset lens is a test of whether you have what it takes. High stakes. Avoid failure, protect self-image. The same challenge encountered through a growth mindset lens is an opportunity to develop. Lower stakes, try things, learn from what happens. The difference in what gets attempted, and therefore what gets built, compounds enormously over time. Scarcity versus abundance is another framework that operates well below most people's conscious awareness, while producing significant effects on their behavior. The scarcity mindset, not just about money, about opportunity, recognition, success, love, operates from the assumption that there isn't enough, that another person's gain is your loss, that the pie is fixed. This produces a specific cluster of behaviors: hoarding, competition where collaboration would be more effective, reluctance to share knowledge or connections, small thinking about what's available. The abundance mindset doesn't require denying that resources are sometimes limited. It requires recognizing that the assumption of scarcity, applied broadly and habitually, causes you to miss available abundance, that the assumption itself renders invisible. The person who believes opportunities are scarce stops looking once they've found one. The person who believes opportunities are abundant keeps looking and keeps finding. The research on priming is relevant here in a way that's easy to underestimate. When you've been thinking in scarcity terms, when your mind has been recently activated around themes of not enough, you literally perform worse on cognitive tasks, make worse financial decisions, and are less able to access creative solutions. Scarcity cognition consumes bandwidth. The preoccupation with what's lacking crowds out the processing capacity needed to see what's available. This is not a character judgment about people who think in scarcity. Scarcity thinking is a rational response to genuine scarcity. The problem is that the lens often persists long after the conditions that generated it have changed, installed during genuinely resource-limited periods, and never updated when circumstances improved. Process versus outcome thinking is a mental model with particular practical value in high-stakes situations. Outcome thinking focuses attention on results, which are real, important, and often partially outside your direct control. Process thinking focuses attention on the actions and behaviors that tend to produce results, which are almost entirely within your control. In situations where outcome focus creates performance anxiety that degrades the performance itself, process focus is not just psychologically calmer, it's strategically superior. The athlete who thinks about winning during a competition performs worse than the athlete who thinks about executing the specific technical elements of their performance. Not because winning doesn't matter, because thinking about winning during competition directs attention away from the inputs that produce winning and toward an output that attention alone cannot generate. This transfers directly to most areas of life where performance under pressure matters. Focus on what you can actually control in the moment, and the outcomes tend to follow. Focus on the outcomes during the moment you need to be executing, and you introduce an anxiety loop that degrades exactly what you're trying to produce. Possibility versus probability is a lens distinction that most analytical people get backwards. Probability thinking, what's likely to happen based on current conditions and past data, is useful for assessing risk and making realistic plans. It is not useful for determining what to attempt. Limiting your attempts to what's probable produces a life that looks exactly like your past, because the probable is determined by historical base rates, and historical base rates don't account for the specific actions you might take, the specific capabilities you're developing, or the specific combinations of factors that produce outlier outcomes. Possibility thinking asks a different question. Not what usually happens, but what could happen if conditions shifted. Not what typically works, but what might work in this specific situation with these specific inputs. The most important achievements in most people's lives were improbable before they happened. They required someone to act from possibility rather than wait for probability to make the case. I spent years running a mental model I can best describe as sophisticated pessimism. The belief that anticipating the worst was a form of intellectual honesty that protected against disappointment. It did protect against disappointment. It also consistently narrowed what I attempted to things I was confident would work, which meant I was consistently operating well within my actual capability, rather than at the edge of it. The reframe that shifted it wasn't positive thinking. It was a simple recognition that I was treating a risk management tool as a reality assessment tool. These are not the same thing. Pessimism is useful for identifying what could go wrong. It is not useful for determining what's possible. Systems thinking deserves mention because it addresses a cognitive limitation that affects nearly everyone's approach to personal change. The tendency to look for single causes and single solutions in situations that are actually networks of interacting variables. Linear thinking traces a straight line from cause to effect. Systems thinking recognizes that most significant outcomes are produced by multiple factors in relationship with each other. The changes in one area produce ripple effects throughout the system, and that the most effective interventions are often not the most obvious ones. Applied to personal development, systems thinking explains why changing a single behavior in isolation often produces disappointing results, while changing the environment, identity, social context, and daily structure simultaneously produces change that sticks. You're not changing a behavior. You're changing a system. The behavior was downstream of the system. Change the system and the behavior follows. The learning versus knowing mindset is worth naming specifically because it determines your relationship to new information, whether it's a threat to your existing model or an upgrade opportunity. A knowing mindset treats incoming information that contradicts existing beliefs as a challenge to be defended against. A learning mindset treats the same information as potentially useful data to be evaluated. In a world changing as rapidly as this one, the knowing mindset is a compounding liability. The person who was right about something important 10 years ago and hasn't updated the model since is operating with increasingly stale information with increasing confidence. The learning mindset treats being wrong as the mechanism of improvement rather than the evidence of inadequacy. Mental models are tools. They are not truths. The most useful relationship to any mental model is, "This is currently the most effective lens I have for navigating this type of situation, and I remain open to finding a better one." Hold them firmly enough to use them, loosely enough to replace them. Because the room keeps changing, and the person who can change their lens to match has access to a version of that room that other people, locked into their original lens, will never see. Chapter 13. The integration. The techniques mean nothing in a quiet room. The question is who you are when you're tired, late, and someone just said the wrong thing. That's where this ends up. Not in the meditation session or the morning visualization or the carefully designed environment where everything supports the practice. In the hallway. In the email thread that's been going sideways for 3 days. In the moment at 11 p.m. when the decision you've been avoiding is still there. Patient as furniture. Waiting. Integration is the part of personal development that doesn't get written about as much as it should. Probably because it's less compelling than transformation and less photogenic than breakthrough. It's not a before and after. It's a Tuesday, and then another Tuesday. And the slow, cumulative work of becoming someone who applies these principles, not when conditions are ideal, but when conditions are exactly what they always are, which is complicated and inconvenient and occasionally unreasonable. The gap between knowing something and being it is the whole problem. And it's a larger gap than most people honestly account for. You can understand conscious awareness completely and still get hijacked by a tone of voice in a meeting. You can know the mechanics of limiting beliefs and still find yourself pulling back from an opportunity before you've consciously decided to. You can have the full theoretical framework for emotional regulation and still send the message you'll wish you hadn't. Understanding is not installation. Knowledge is not behavior. The gap between them is where most personal development efforts quietly expire. Closing that gap requires something less exciting than a new framework. It requires repetition in real conditions. Not controlled conditions, real ones. The difficult conversation is the practice. The setback is the practice. The moment when the old pattern is pulling hard and the new one is still fragile, that moment is the practice. Not a test of whether you've learned something. The actual learning. This is why the concept of implementation intentions, specific plans for when, where, and how a behavior will occur, matters so much more than it sounds. Vague intentions to be more present, more resilient, more emotionally regulated exist at the level of aspiration. Implementation intentions exist at the level of behavior. When I notice I'm getting reactive in this type of conversation, I will take one breath before responding. When I catch negative self-talk before a presentation, I will replace it with this specific statement. When I feel the pull to avoid the difficult task, I will do 5 minutes of it before deciding whether to continue. The specificity isn't bureaucratic, it's neurological. Specific plans create specific cues that trigger specific behaviors. The decision is made in advance, in a calm moment, by the version of you with full cognitive resources available. The in-the-moment version, tired, pressured, reactive, just executes the plan rather than negotiating with the impulse. Morning routines matter not because there's magic in the morning, but because the beginning of the day is the one reliably quiet moment most people have before the external world asserts its demands. What you do with those first minutes, the mental tone you set, the intentions you clarify, the state you consciously inhabit before the day begins trying to install a different one, has disproportionate influence on what follows. Not because you've armored yourself against difficulty, but because you've oriented yourself towards something specific before the noise begins competing for your direction. The routine doesn't need to be elaborate. It needs to be consistent. 5 minutes of deliberate mental orientation beats an hour of ideal practice 3 times a week. Consistency compounds. Intensity does not, in the absence of consistency. Evening reflection creates a feedback loop that most people skip, because by the end of the day, the cognitive resources required for honest self-assessment are exactly what's been most depleted. This is a real obstacle. It's also worth pushing slightly against, because the reflection period is when the day's experiences get encoded. And how they get encoded determines what you learn from them. A few specific questions asked consistently produce more useful data than extended journaling sessions done occasionally. Where did I apply these principles today? Where did I revert to old patterns? What triggered the reversion? What would I do differently? Not as self-criticism, as calibration. The pilot reviewing the flight data not to feel bad about the turbulence, but to understand what produced it and what to adjust. The triggers are worth specific attention, because they're the points where the old system asserts itself most reliably. Everyone has them. The particular type of criticism that lands differently than other criticism. The specific flavor of being ignored or dismissed that produces a reaction disproportionate to the event. The circumstance that reliably collapses your confidence in a way that other circumstances don't. These aren't random. They're connected to the original programming, the specific experiences that installed the pattern in the first place. You don't need to fully excavate the origin to work with the trigger. You need to know the trigger is there, recognize it when it activates, and have a pre-decided response ready to deploy before the automatic pattern completes itself. The recognition is the gap. The gap is the practice. Relationships are the most demanding integration environment and the most valuable one. Other people are relentlessly good at finding the edges of your practice. They don't mean to be. They're just being themselves, which includes being occasionally difficult, occasionally misunderstanding you, occasionally needing things that conflict with what you need. Every one of these moments is an integration opportunity, a chance to apply emotional regulation, conscious communication, reframing, and the observer stance in real time under real conditions. The relationship that challenges you most is often doing more for your development than the practices you do alone. Not because difficulty is inherently developmental, it isn't, but because the specific difficulties that recur in relationships tend to be precisely the places where your psychological work is least complete. The pattern that keeps appearing with different people in different contexts is telling you something about the internal system, not about the people. Work provides a different integration laboratory. The pressure of deadlines, the friction of collaboration, the specific stress of being evaluated. These are conditions under which your actual psychology reveals itself more clearly than any amount of quiet reflection. The focus practices from Chapter 7, the resilience framework from Chapter 8, the emotional regulation from Chapter 6. They're tested in the work environment in ways that are immediate and specific and provide rapid feedback on whether the integration is working or whether it's still theoretical. The compound effect of consistent integration practice is genuinely difficult to perceive from inside it because the changes are incremental and the baseline shifts with them. You don't notice becoming calmer because calm has become your normal. You don't notice the automatic negative thought you caught and redirected because catching and redirecting has become the default. The absence of the old pattern is invisible in a way the presence of it never was. This is why external feedback and comparison points matter. Not for validation, but for calibration. Someone who knew you 2 years ago and observes you now. A journal entry from 18 months back that describes a reaction you no longer recognize as yours. These external reference points reveal the change that internal perspective can't see because it's inside the change. The practices themselves need to evolve. The visualization routine that was exactly right 6 months ago may need adjustment as your circumstances and goals develop. The morning practice that worked during one period of life may need restructuring during another. Integration is not static. It's a living system that requires the same attention and willingness to update that you apply to the beliefs and mental models it supports. Rigidity about the practices is just another form of the fixed mindset applied to the development process itself. The belief that the right method has been found and should now be followed precisely regardless of what the results are indicating. The practices serve the development. When they stop serving it, they get updated. The goal is not fidelity to the technique. The goal is the person you're becoming, sharing what you've learned, not as performance, not as unsolicited advice, but as genuine contribution when the context makes it relevant. Deepens the integration in ways that solo practice doesn't reach. Teaching requires you to understand something well enough to make it accessible to someone else, which reveals the gaps in your own understanding with useful precision. Modeling the principles in your behavior without narrating it creates something in the people around you that explicit teaching rarely produces. The lived demonstration of what's possible. There will be regressions, long ones occasionally. Weeks where the old patterns reassert themselves completely, and the new ones feel like something you read once in a book that may or may not apply to you. This is not failure. It's the non-linear nature of development, which moves forward the way weather moves, with patterns and trends and occasional dramatic reversals that don't negate the overall direction. What matters in a regression is not the regression itself, it's the return. How quickly you notice, how cleanly you come back to the practice without the additional suffering of extended self-judgment about having left it. The return, done without drama, is itself the practice. Integration, finally, is not a state you achieve. It's a direction you keep choosing. In the quiet room and in the hallway and at 11 p.m. when the difficult decision is still there, you choose the direction again. That's all. Again and again and again, until the choosing becomes who you are. Remember the 7-year-old from the first page, the one told they were bad at art, or not enough, or too much. That voice didn't go away. It never goes away entirely. But here's what changed. Not the voice. Your relationship to it. You can hear it now without automatically believing it. You can watch the pattern activate without being consumed by it. You can feel the old belief assert itself and recognize it as a file. Old, installed without your consent, rather than a verdict about who you permanently are. that gap between stimulus and response, the one that barely existed when you started. That gap is the whole game. Everything that matters happens inside it. It won't always work. The pattern will complete itself before you noticed it running. The emotion will move in and start making decisions before the observer got home. This is not failure. This is the work. The return, without drama, is the practice. What you're building is not a perfected self. That's a destination invented to keep you permanently dissatisfied with the journey. What you're building is a different relationship to your own mind. The 7-year-old drafted the blueprint. You don't have to live in the building.